Welcome to Career Practitioner Conversations. This podcast is presented by the National Career Development Association. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Melissa Venable, NCDA Director of Professional Development, and this episode continues our 2025 DEI Symposium Series with a conversation about racism in the workplace. I'm here with Dr. Frank Gorritz, a counselor educator in Florida, and thanks for being here, Frank. It's good to have you here again.
It's awesome to be here. I always love doing this with you.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm excited to get this one kicked off. So let's start with some background information. Why
Okay.
did you pick this topic, and how do you see it fitting into this series as a whole?
Sure. I mean, it makes me think back to the overall theme for the conference of 2025, which was, evolving and adapting career development in revolutionary times. And I think a lot of times, there's some conversation about racism in the workplace, right? We talk about how maybe there's like basic microaggressions. We have a racist coworker or a racist boss. But I don't think we ever really talk about racist systems in the workplace and what that actually looks like as we are adapting career development to really consider for those minority stresses in the workplace. And there's a reason to that as well that, I want to get into. One of the reasons why I think this is important is because it's about, white supremacy in the workplace. And I think white supremacy in particular throws people off because when we hear this term, we think, okay, we think about KKK, we think about like white nationalists, we think about folks who are overtly racist, right? But that's not what white supremacy is. White supremacy is an ideology, and an ideology is not as covert as people think it is, right? So, I study discourse analysis, and something that's really interesting when we think about discourse, right? Our social conversations, the topics that are on our minds, the language we share, all of that is guided by ideology, even if it's unconscious. Very much so that when we take facts for granted, because it's just the automatic, right? That's what I'm talking about there of the underlying discourse and ideology. Sometimes that can happen in the workplace too, in ways we just don't realize. And so that was one of the major reasons why I was inspired by this topic and wanted to share it for the symposium.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think that really does tie it into some of the other topics. So those of you that are out there listening, be sure you take a look at all the topics in this series and how they all do really work together to bring us all up to speed with what we need to be thinking about in these times. So, Frank, in your session, you shared of the term work adjustment and the need to focus on work adjustment. What is that, and why is it important when dealing with these issues in the workplace?
So when I think about, the theory of work adjustment, which is by Dawes and Lofquist, if I'm not mistaken, they really talk about this idea that we really need to start thinking about how the workplace interacts with you as a system. So in their basic terminology, they basically go into the idea of, hey, we have reinforcers and we have non-reinforcers in the workplace, right? There are going to be some times where you're happy and your employer is happy with you too. Okay, great. Awesome. Sometimes you're both not happy with each other, and that happens too. And sometimes that'll lead to quitting, right? Or even firing. Sometimes the employee is happy, but the employer is not happy with the employee. And that's where I think white supremacy plays a huge role because one of the biggest things that I tend to notice in workplace hostility and workplace violence is the idea of gaslighting and the undertone of we don't want you here. And a lot of times, too, white cultural norms are tied into that to make employees of color feel uncomfortable or to also maybe make them feel like they don't have support or the resources they need in the hopes that they quit, right? Because let's think about it, right? If we get an employee to quit, then we don't have to pay them unemployment. So we can drive them out. It won't be a big deal. It's easier to say that they quit on their own accord and we'll be, hands off free from that person's decision. But we can make it super hard on them until they give up. And so we notice a lot of that happening just across various workplaces. I don't even think there's like a specific workplace that I have in mind or like type of workplace. I think what's interesting about this is that it can happen all across the board, whether you work in retail, especially, or whether you work in food industry, whether you work even in legal settings, like or even office settings, right? Corporation settings, academic settings. They all, I think sometimes these unspoken norms show up and sometimes they can be weaponized against employees of color. And so that was another major basis for this presentation. And I think that's where work adjustment especially plays a role because career counselors out there need to really start thinking about what are the expectations around how we expect people of color to just navigate racial hostility in the workplace. Some employees might be okay because they don't let that bother them. Maybe they feel resilient enough where they don't have to do anything about it. Some folks don't feel that way. And some folks really struggle with the mental health implications of racial hostility, whether that be like depression, anxiety, minority stress, also leading to like internalized guilt and blame. Like somehow it's my fault that I'm doing something wrong, that my workplace is treating me this way. There could be a lot of adverse effects on employees of color. And so career counselors need to start getting to these conversations if we all notice here, hey, there's some racial work dynamics happening here. How are you feeling about that? And that's where, when I think about the topic I presented on last year about quiet quitting, that especially sort of shows up because what we don't talk about is quiet firing and racist and hostile in a way influences in the workplace reinforce quiet firing.
There's a lot to unpack here, Frank. We might need more than our allotted 20 to 30 minutes. Yeah, you're linking this issue to it's not just about employment and whether you have a job or don't have a job. There's so much else that we need to think about in terms of personal identity, in terms of trauma, in terms of mental health. So this is something, and as you're bringing this to our audience, which I want to remind everyone, our main audience really is made up of career counselors, career coaches, career advisors, people that are helping those in the workplace who are trying to navigate all this. Microaggressions is a word that you used in your session, microaggressions in the workplace. What does that look like, particularly for someone that's a minoritized worker? And how do we know when we see it or when we hear it?
Oh, that's such a good question. Because I think too, like anytime I talk to anybody who has a minoritized identity, they just feel it in their body when a microaggression happens. Like your body just sort of recognizes and remembers its discomfort. Somehow, our brains are programmed to like keep us safe, right? And so when a microaggression happens, your brain goes, what was that about? Do I have to worry about like my comfort here? And what is that about? Which is also why a lot of times when people experience microaggressions, they don't realize it until days later because your brain is still trying to process it. And we notice that as an issue too, which is why, I want to let career counselors know about that in this episode, that sometimes it takes a minute for people to register going, I think this person just microaggressed against me. And when we think about this term, it's such a blasé term. Like, we hear it all the time. It's such a buzzword. But microaggression really is, when you think about it, aggression that is transmitted to somebody on a smaller scale where it's more intimate based on somebody's minoritized identities and sort of the power relations between maybe race or maybe gender. That's when we see a microaggression happening. I will say that there are multiple types of microaggressions. So there's micro insults where somebody may deliver an insult that's unintentional, but definitely have some like racist undertones, gendered undertones, right? Then there's micro assaults. And micro assaults are when people say things that are assaulting to another person or even do things like assault another person because of their minoritized identity. And in the workplace, that might look like having a colleague literally come at you with hurtful words and threats, etc., because you just identify as POC or any other minoritized group. And then micro invalidations are when a smaller system validates the invalidation you're feeling. Now, I know that's a lot to swallow, but what's really wild about that one is that's where a lot of the gaslighting happens, because a micro invalidation is a whole system basically telling you your experiences aren't valid. And so you're not somebody we believe if we reach out to help and say, hey, listen, like if we reach out for help and say, hey, I feel like I'm experiencing microaggressions. If micro invalidations are happening in the workplace, it can be very hard to get support unless you reach outside the workplace. And that's where career counselors can really play a strong role going, I could definitely see the gaslighting here of them telling you that there isn't an issue, but maybe they have policies that absolutely make it an issue. And here's a great example of that, because this actually happens in a lot of places right now, especially with trans rights and trans inclusivity, right? Maybe like corporations or businesses that say, hey, like we're trans friendly, but they still only have a gender binary bathroom, right? So it's those little
Yeah.
things that make you like feel a little unwelcome and go, yes, you care about us, but do we actually belong here? And that's like a big issue. Same with, and this is huge for so many workplaces. We see it all the time. So any workplaces, if you feel triggered by this, I am so sorry, but it's got to happen, where oftentimes workplaces might preach we are all about diversity, and when you look at their staff, they're primarily white or primarily men, primarily able-bodied. And so whose diversity are you prioritizing? And what does diversity actually mean to you if everything around you doesn't back up what you're saying? And I think a lot of minoritized folks are tired of that, of feeling taken for granted by the fact that you keep promising that you're going to give me a nurturing environment, and all I see around me is just constant invalidation and nothing maybe even changing. So when I say microaggression tends to fall into one of the three camps of either micro insults, micro assaults, or micro invalidation, because these are all just forms of aggression that minoritized people feel. Not only just feel emotionally, but sometimes like feel in their soul. And I've heard clients tell me that before. And I sat there and I go, ouch, yes, I think I know what you mean, because it's
Yeah.
just this sort of unexplainable psychological discomfort. And that's definitely something that career counselors can really take with them and start unpacking with their clients.
Oh, yeah. Things that aren't necessarily against the rules, right? That aren't necessarily
That's it. Exactly.
it, illegal or in the manual that you get as an employee of,
That's
it's not
correct.
in the compliance training necessarily, but they are um, seriously negative effects on the individual as well as on the workplace and potentially productivity and everything else that goes with it.
100%. Yeah. That's a
All
great
right.
example of micro invalidation right there. Absolutely.
Yeah. These are crazy times.
Mm.
Empl Employment is hard to come by, right? If you're on LinkedIn, you see all of the people who are open to work. You hear about all the layoffs. So we've got folks who are potentially in situations that they're uncomfortable in, but they can't leave because there's not a lot of employment options. So wonderful for that group to know that there's this group of professionals, these career development professionals, coaches, counselors, advisors that they can reach out to in their communities and maybe even among their employers to get more information, to get support. So your session at the symposium at the conference had the word training in the title as well. So where can our audience find the most helpful resources and the most helpful training to help prepare them to prepare these students and clients for these kinds of situations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so I think when it comes to training, there's not a lot out there, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things out there. So I think about and this is especially true for just building resilience among our employees of color, or even employees who have intersectional or connecting identities of race or gender, etc. So some of the biggest inspirations for me include, and I'm going to pull up a little list because I absolutely love these people and their resources. And I think career counselors, as well as people who are wondering if they're experiencing microaggressions in the workplace, can really, really check this out. And so there's actually a resource by, and I'm trying to see, so it's very interesting. So if you look at drworksbook.com, I think it's Okun and Jones, and they talk about white supremacy culture. It's actually dismantlingracism.org. If you guys check that out and you get to see some primers on white supremacy culture, I mean, that is the ultimate tea to serve, when you're sitting here going, wait a minute, no, I know what's happening to me. We're doing this, and my workplace is doing this, or I have colleagues who are doing this to me, right? Of a lot of times when we think about the effects of microaggressions, especially racial, of making employees feel smaller than you, breaking their self-esteem, making them feel like there's something wrong with them as well, like that they don't belong, they're out of sorts. Even sometimes going as far as to show signs of disgust that they are there in the workplace, or even avoiding eye contact. All of it is just there. So if you want to know more about like white supremacy culture, definitely check out dismantlingracism.org. I found it to be a very helpful resource. And Deepa Iyer, last name Iyer, has a book called Social Change Now, A Guide for Reflection and Connection. I live for Deepa Iyer. So Deepa, if you're listening, hey girl, hey. Her book is absolutely wonderful because I think for clients, it goes into the different roles that you can take in terms of reclaiming your autonomy. And I really wanted to focus a little bit on resources like that during the presentation. So for example, what would it look like for your clients who are navigating racial microaggressions to look for people in their lives or at work who fulfill certain roles of healing and empowerment? But also, how can clients also take on some of those roles themselves? And all of these roles that Deepa Iyer talks about in terms of promoting social change, they're quite natural for many of us. These are things that we do all the time. So a great example is Deepa Iyer talks about the guide. And so finding somebody who's a guide in the workplace or tapping into your inner guide, this is somebody who, for example, believes that they have a responsibility to mentor and support others to challenge old systems. Maybe somebody who has gained wisdom and skills through experiences in these types of situations. And that in itself can be such a blessing. If maybe your client has somebody access to somebody in their workplace, or even just find somebody who maybe used to work there and actually receive support in that way. I mean, I think community support can definitely go very, very far if we know what type of roles to look for, as well as what types of roles we want to fulfill, maybe for other people who are navigating the same thing, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. The power of developing a network, not
Mhm.
only of people that can advise you and provide some sort of expertise, but also colleagues and kindred spirits who are experiencing the same things, and so that you have other people that you can talk to about kind of how they're navigating, and just commiserate if that
Sure.
that can be helpful too, to know that you're not in it on your own.
Right.
Yeah, we will get those links in the show notes. So listeners, take a look at the episode show notes, and we'll have the links that Frank has mentioned in there for you as well. All right, Frank. So career counselors and coaches, what do they need to focus on when they're working one-on-one or in a group setting with students and clients,
Mm.
either in a counseling session, or in the programming that they're putting together at career centers and with their offices? Where do they need to be putting their focus right now?
That's a really good question too. I think something that I always emphasize to students and counselors in training is first and foremost focusing on the person in front of you. The very simple, how are you? And not falling for the bullshit, fine answer, right? But like really reading somebody's body language and saying, I hear you saying that, and you seem a little down right now too. Can you tell me more about like what's going on? Sometimes even through that simple invitation, I have clients all the time, counseling wise, who absolutely spill out everything that is happening just because they were invited to share what's presently on their mind. And I think what's so important about that is that clients aren't always able to piece everything together right away. So a lot of times They might dump a whole bunch of puzzle pieces metaphorically in front of you, going, I have no idea what is happening at this workplace, but I'm experiencing this, I'm noticing this. And then we can hold some really supportive space in putting some points together of like, hey, I noticed, for example, that you mentioned that you noticed somebody getting harassed in the workplace, and it made you think back to a time when you were harassed maybe by that same person 3 months ago. And that brought up some feelings for you. How is that making you feel about where you work? That's a big question I don't hear a lot of clients being asked is, how does that make you feel about where you work? And that's such a huge, powerful question because I think clients are secretly thinking it, but maybe they don't always come out with that. And so also having the right questions to broach the topics. How are you feeling about your workplace environment? With all of the things that are happening right now politically, how is your workplace treating those issues? Right? Especially when you think about a lot of censorship that's going on right now, there's probably a lot of minoritized workers and employees who feel especially oppressed right now because they're absolutely feeling the historical context of today, yet they know that their bosses don't support those experiences and sometimes even shut them down. So there's definitely a lot to unpack there. But to answer your question, I would say the simple invitations of how are you? Tell me about what's been going on lately at work. How are you feeling about your place of work? And another powerful question, how does your workplace make you feel? Because a lot of times for minoritized workers, I think that's where that starts to come out too, of like, I've always been asked maybe how do I feel, but how does my workplace make me feel? Do they make me feel valued, or do they make me feel like a second priority, or do they make me feel alone? And I definitely think there's things you can unpack with that. The more knowledgeable we are about like social systems and how they operate. And it doesn't mean either in any way, shape, or form that we're looking for some sort of reason to trash a workplace or something along those lines. We genuinely want to address issues that are happening that people of color and minoritized employees are feeling all the time, but maybe don't have the space to share that. And that's exactly what we're doing here.
Yeah, I heard that word there at the end, space. Yeah, so that the very first step is to create a space that
Yes.
allows the person that you're speaking with to connect
Yeah.
with what's happening with them, to connect with you, and for you to connect with them as a human being. And it seems very compassionate to just to start with that kind of a question to set the tone for what's happening. It maybe it's a meeting for a resume critique, but that's not necessarily
Yes.
what what the pressing issue is. So by opening it up to yeah, to talk about what's important to that person sounds like an amazing habit for us all to get started. Maybe not only with our meetings with students and clients, but in our regular meetings with colleagues, to just start with kind of how are we all doing?
100%. And something that's really important to point out right now is that, when I was talking about censorship earlier, that's actually happening in counselor education too. And sometimes, without knowing it, educators sometimes perpetuate some of this because what they say is, don't talk about politics with your clients. And of course, it doesn't mean that we're pulling out the US flag when we sit with our client and like preaching to them about systems. No, that's not what that means. But if counselors feel like they can't broach those topics, it does prevent us from being able to culturally broach with a client who might be going through that and might be going through something that is considered political, which, by the way, all of our social identities are politicized, right? They
Indeed, yeah.
100% are. And we all know it too. We all know that for sure because we all know a system that we can identify that's oppressive. Whether we're in the same camp or not, we can all agree that there's some sort of ism that bothers you. And so, with that, I definitely think if we continue to perpetuate this message of like no politics in the counseling room, what if their identities are so politicized that is part of their lived experience. And political events are, in fact, very salient to them. So, what happens then? And so, I definitely think educators and students alike who are listening, you definitely have the platform to approach political topics. It doesn't mean you're preaching about political parties, But what it means is that you're giving space to a client to talk about some really taboo things with you about how a workplace is making them feel based on one's position of power in society and how they're viewed in society.
These are such complicated times. It's really hard to avoid the effect of what we see on the news or hear on the news and which news we might be listening to. So there's a whole range of information just coming at us from all directions. And it doesn't seem to be slowing in any way. So it's something we're all going to have to continue to adjust and adapt, which is kind of where we started the conversation.
How full circle I live. Yeah.
So, Frank, I just want to say thank you so much for bringing this conversation to the podcast, for bringing the topic to the symposium this past summer. And I'm looking forward to continuing to follow your work. And thank you for being out there doing great things.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate you and NCDA really giving people the platform to talk about emerging issues in the workplace, because that's really what we're here for, as NCDA. And I know people always harp on career counseling. I have no idea why. I have no idea why. But if you're one of those people, those listeners, you know who I'm talking about. But stop doing that, because career counseling is really valuable, and it's more valuable than ever because we spend most of our lives at work. And so how are we going to do counseling if you can't talk about what's happening at work? So career counseling should be one of the major foci in counselor training, and it's certainly no second-rated topic. So just correcting all the people out there and letting them know that NCDA is the place where we're giving you guys updated trainings, updated information. Definitely, even if you're not a career counselor, check out NCDA and its resources, because definitely you will have a client who talks about their workplace with you eventually. So it's better to have some resources available rather than just be like, oh, well, I'm not really sure. Because NCA is definitely a hub for some good resources and definitely some great space to hold with like-minded professionals and very supportive educators in the field. So I'm very grateful.
Thanks so much for that shout out to NCDA in particular, Frank. I hope to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Thank you.